the Tom Bradbury interview, he did push back a little bit and asked a couple of awkward questions. But there's been no kind of hardline pushback from anyone that they've been interviewed by, because they're choosing the interviewers carefully. I mean, Tom Bradbury, I think, did do a good job, but it's not like they had an interview with Piers Morgan, who would be on the opposite end of the spectrum. I mean, I don't necessarily like him as an interviewer anyway. He talks over people, but someone of that scale who's, not in it for the prestige or whatever and just wants, to get the other side across. But the more he talks, the stupider he sounds, in my view. It's just all the contradictions, and is he some kind of constant gardener that's got a leaking hose and is constantly having to replant his petunias? Because all he ever seems to say is the leaking and the planting and the leaking and the planting. And it's just like, what are you talking about? You've got no evidence. Yes, people leak stuff. Yes, people plant stuff. And then he keeps saying, oh, now the world knows that, the institution's got a relationship with the press. The world knows that that's been happening for at least a decade. We've known that that's happened for, the last 100 years, maybe?
Since the dawn of the press.
Since the dawn of the press, yeah. They've always had a relationship with them, especially since Diana passed, which has obviously been more than a decade, because that was 1997. They have not a reciprocal relationship, but a relationship where the press agree to leave them alone on certain occasions if the press are allowed to be invited on certain occasions. I wouldn't call that leaking and planting. I'd call that a relationship with the press. And Prince Harry and Meghan have arguably had a bigger relationship with the press than anybody else in the royal family has ever had. So it's bizarre to me why he's going in on them for that. And quite frankly, like, the amount of stuff that's coming out, it's bullying, in my opinion, at this point, because the definition of, bullying someone is usually somebody picking on someone who's defenseless, who can't defend themselves. And he knows full well that William and Kate will not speak on it. They're not going to defend themselves. They're not going to react to it at all. And yet he keeps on going constantly. I don't know what, if he can say anything else. But he defends his actions by saying, well, I'm healing from it, and this is, I'm telling the truth. People are going to tell my story anyway, so I'm going to tell the truth. We don't know that it's the truth. It's your story. That's all it is.
Yeah, precisely. It's all just, again, based on what he's saying. There's nothing seems to have been backed up by anything legitimate or anything substantial ever. And it was the leaking and the planting thing, like, what, based on what? Where do you get the evidence from? What could have potentially happened? So let's say when it happened with Meghan living in the household, she was horrible. And I'm saying this in the same way as Harry's making these bold statements, when he wasn't probably there for some of the things that he's saying is what happened or isn't what happened. I'm going to say that Meghan was horrible to the staff. I'm going to say that based on my own observations of what I've seen from Meghan, based on records of people who've interacted with her outside of the household, etc. A bunch of circumstances suggests to me, and also based on a few little tells that came out of this thing. Sometimes you just have to read between the lines with her. She's horrible to her staff, and she was horrible to the royal staff household. There might have been some members of that household that could have told maybe a relative or a friend, and that relative or friend could have gone to the press. That's not a leak. That's not a leak. That's not dropping or planting a story. That's not that. That's Meghan being vile and someone exposing her for being a horrible person. That's a different thing. So he's almost giving her absolutely, completely no circumstances she have to be accountable for anything. It's all leaking and planting the stories. It's like, well, were any of the stories true? Were some of them true?
Well, just to pick up on what you said there about accountability, what I've found from this is that Harry accepts no accountability for himself at all.
No.
Which is strange because usually when people have had therapy, they'll understand a lot of things, but they'll also, they're also told to take accountability for some of the things that they've done that maybe errors or wrong or not necessarily malicious or out to get somebody, but the mistakes they've made. And all that Harry is doing is deflecting back at the royal family, and he's not actually being accountable for any of his own actions at all. And it's interesting to me that he wants the royal family to take accountability, but he's not willing to take anything of it himself. It's like, oh, I want a relationship, but I want them to be accountable. But you're not being accountable. You're not being accountable. And when you're questioned on that accountability, when somebody says, well, why are you doing all these stories about them? Oh, well, I needed to. It was my story. You're not being accountable for the hurt that you're causing. You're certainly not being accountable for anything that that your wife may have caused. And you're not being accountable for, the interviews and the countless barrage of insults, really. And they're veiled insults, but very thinly veiled, and everybody can see through them. Because it's essentially just attack. But he wants everyone to think that, he is accountable. He's taking responsibility by giving this story, when in fact the story is the attack, and that's what he should be taking accountability for, but he refuses. It's all smoke and mirrors, but not good enough ones. Like the smoke's a crappy fog machine that you'd have at a 4-year-old's birthday party, and the mirrors are all frosted glass. Like, we can see straight through everything that you're doing. And one of the reasons we can do that is because you trip yourself up again and again and again and again by retelling the same thing in a different way, by claiming things in different ways, and by basically just talking and talking and talking. And the thing about lying is you have to have a very good memory in order to keep up the same lie constantly. It's exhausting, and they aren't doing that because we're catching them out in their lies, because they're saying one thing in one interview and something completely different in another. And that's not speculation. We've got proof of that. We've posted proof of that ourselves on our own channel, right? We can prove that that's what they're doing.
Yeah, we've made plenty of shorts at this point about it, definitely. And this is the thing, so, it's accountable, absolutely, with Harry. He's quite terrifying, actually, and it's probably a bit of a strange word to use because he's so whiny for someone supposed to be so terrifying. But look at some of our history with the monarchs and things. He was second in line of succession, well, third, sorry, wasn't he? Because Charles was then, obviously, until William had his children. So he's still fifth. I think it is number 5. So, if something horrible was to happen to William and family, etc., well, God forbid, of course, but he would technically still be in line. Now, he didn't seem to just, he should be able to sort of say, I don't want to be in the line of succession. Again, that's something that he's not seeming to do. Well, why is he not doing that? Why is he not doing it? So he's claiming that he doesn't like this or that. But the point is, he technically isn't too far away from potentially becoming a monarch. And his approach to the situation, like Queen Elizabeth, who passed before, Charles is not doing too bad. I'll be giving him some credit, but the benchmark is his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. She absolutely as a dote on her husband, she absolutely adored her family. You could just see it, absolutely see it. But she always put her country first. Now, Harry very much comes across as the guy who would literally silence the press to keep his wife happy. Destroy the press to keep his wife happy. That's comes across as a vendetta with him. Very self-centered, very self-centric. Accountability is a perfect example. He's not taking any responsibility for the stuff that he said. I mean, the initial quote that I read out to you when he started this from the beginning, from an excerpt from the book, just nasty about William's appearance, was when he was delivering this, when it was being read to him by Anderson, he had a smirk on his face. And it's like, those sorts of reactions tell quite a lot about a person. And it's like, well, why should we start being so empathetic and understanding and caring about your story when you just don't seem to be caring about anything other than Meghan and himself? Probably his children as well, obviously, but that's his bubble, which I can't begrudge somebody for being this way, but then don't expect other people not to call you out on it.
No, exactly. I don't know if he's living in some kind of fantasy world, because, in regards to William, he said something else about sibling rivalry, but we're going to have to read the book to get the full story, because we were just, even in the Tom Bradbury interview, it was just passages, so we weren't getting the full thing. But there was one thing in the Tom Bradbury interview where he said something about we had enough of this sibling rivalry, and if it was a game, wouldn't William be strides ahead of me because he was married with kids and all this? So, but I don't know where that statement come from, because I don't know what he'd written before that. Hence, we're gonna have to read the book. But that's just a really weird thing to say. Who is having a sibling rivalry, and why would it be about getting a wife and kids? This is all in Harry's head, I feel. And there probably was some kind of sibling rivalry to an extent, because with siblings there usually always is, especially when you're young. But to have that over having a wife and kids and stuff, I don't think anybody cares. So I think this is from Harry, want of a better phrase, for being the spare. I think he probably took everything a little bit more personally than William did.
Well, that's it. That went back to the school thing, wasn't it? When you mentioned that earlier, didn't we, about the school? So when you get to school, they're like, William wouldn't talk to me. It's like, oh my God, I don't know anybody who does have siblings and hasn't experienced the situation when you do go to the same school as them.
Well, yeah, because there's 4 years between me and my sister, so I was in year 7 of the same school when she was in year 11. And my first day of school, Mum packed us off together. She was, my sister was responsible for getting me on the bus, etc. But she made me walk behind her, and when I got on the bus, she wouldn't speak to me. And then when it got to the school stop, she was just like, "We'll get off here," and then walk down this road. And when we were at school, the only time she would ever speak to me is if she wanted some of my lunch money because she'd forgot her own or spent it on whatever, or to basically bully me a little bit and, and call me names. That's the only time she would speak to me at school, because that's just what siblings do, especially when you're, at slightly different ages. There's 2 years between Harry and William, so by the time Harry got to school, William would have had his established friends, and it would have been time for Harry to go and establish his friends. But that's a completely normal thing. I don't think there's any malice in that. That's just a part of growing up. And I think there's going to be siblings out there that, it might not be that way for them because they're close and everybody's different. But I think there's also going to be a lot of people in the same boat with siblings that have had that same reaction at school. And this is what I mean about the smoke and mirrors. It's like making mountains out of tiny, tiny molehills. And I think that's really what it is. He's taking something.
Let's make it a little bit more English. It's making huge storms out of tiny little teacups. There you go. It's more of an English reference.
Exactly. Making huge storms out of the tiny Royal Doulton. But I think that's what he's doing, because I don't think anything else is particularly interesting. So he's taking something that everybody else thinks is very small and perhaps a normal part of life, and he's blowing it up like it was this big thing. And I don't think it was, and I don't think it was to him at the time. I think he's probably written this book and thought, oh well, what can I say? Oh, he was mean to me at high school. But any normal person hearing that story would just be like, well, yeah, that's what it was like for most people with siblings older than them in the same school. But he's managing to twist a narrative, to use his own words. He's managing to twist a narrative and, like you say, take a very big storm out of a tiny little teacup.
Yeah, and it's true. Like, obviously, it was front loaded again, pretty much similar to the Netflix series as well. Very front loaded with the stuff that people are interested in, which is the Harry thing, particularly with his mother. Huge, huge sympathy for that, of course. Very, very awful thing to happen, and it's just a case though. And then it ends into this like attack thing again. So the last time in the documentary, the attack was the UK. It's people, it's history, it's culture, everything. The UK was the enemy. It was racist. It was evil. All those sorts of things last time. This time, it's more, for the front loaded with Diana stuff, and then at the end of it, attacking the British press, attacking his brother, his family. This time that's when the sort of the nasty stuff came at the end. But what's interesting in terms of like, we're supposed to feel sorry for Harry, and it's his story. We need to listen to it. We need to engage in things like that. And there's most definitely some sympathy regarding Diana. Of course, there always will be. But there doesn't seem to be any care or any worry or concern or fear or any kind of, love for his brother and what his brother has had to go through with this. Because you could make an argument that in a lot of ways, what William had to deal with is far greater, because he had to balance losing his mother as the older sibling, seeing his younger brother handling it badly, while also being third in line of succession. That, to me, that's a lot more to deal with. Harry had the time, he had less pressure of being that situation. He obviously had his father's love, because he spoke about Charles very highly. And all of the instruments were available to him, as well as not having the responsibility of being in line in the heir. So, to me, the argument falls more in favour of William in that regard, because William had a lot more to deal with. And at a young age, there was only a couple of years between them anyway. And so that's why his bitterness, it just makes it even more unpalatable, really, that he's even more just resentful. It's like, get a grip. You don't know. I don't know if they're personality types. I would be worried, because I think if their personality types were the same, because I think you are sort of born with your personality type. I think you have circumstances that can bring this out and bring that out and put this there and put that there. Would Harry been a different person had Diana have passed? Not passed, sorry. Yeah, he would have been more like maybe the Harry that we have seen and we do connect with, and that was present occasionally. You'll see flashes of it. And then maybe this side of him wouldn't quite have been there, but it would have always been there. Now, William had the same traumatic experience, but his personality type, as well as the stuff on top of it, meant that he's handled it in a completely different way, by finding a beautiful wife who's absolutely correct for the role. But I don't think that's why they're together. I think that was just a lucky break in a way, as well as having his lovely children. All of those things. I'm definitely more on the side of William and what he's had to go through. And then to have this come out now, this is something that William's going to have to suffer, because Harry is not going to have to suffer from this. William is. What Harry's done. Harry's done it now. He might have to suffer down the line, because there'll be consequences for him. I don't think this marriage will last. I've said it, and I'll say it again. I do not think Harry and Meghan will last.